All right, so this video lesson is all about the area of a parallelogram. So as we start this lesson, I'm going to do my best to draw a parallelogram. And we are just going to talk a little bit about where this area formula comes from. So if I take a look at this parallelogram and I break this piece off, this triangle essentially, right? And I make this a right triangle where I've dropped that altitude that calculates that vertical perpendicular height. I could actually consider tracing this triangle. And if I did that, which, see if I can do it very well, and I could move that, it would create the rest of my parallelogram. It would basically move that triangle over to the other side and make a rectangle. So when we look at a parallelogram, we are actually picturing chopping off the area of this right triangle, moving it to the other side, and then now I just have the area of my base times the area of my height. Well, if I'm thinking about that, this base right here is the same as this base right here. We just moved that, that length of the bottom of the triangle over. So when we come up with the area of a parallelogram, we are looking at the area of a rectangle, really, which is the base times the height. Now, when you are looking at a parallelogram, it's just important that when you're looking at it, the base is going to be pretty easy to see if you have it oriented this way. And the height has to always be that perpendicular height. It is not this slant height over here. It's the perpendicular height. And that's why it's the same as our area of a rectangle. So if I drew my parallelogram a little bit differently, I drew it about the same, but let's say I wanted to consider this my base, I would need to make sure that my height is the perpendicular height. Okay, that it is not, and I'm not even sure I drew that very well, but you get the idea. I think that's about right. That your height is the perpendicular height to both your bases. Okay, so both of these should be perpendicular or right angles. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. Just like always, this is going to come back and ask us to think about some of the things we already know and understand about triangles or rectangles. And when I look at this example, it asks us to determine the area of the parallelogram. So I do know my base right here. And so I do know that's 10, but I don't really know what my height is, because my height is going to be this perpendicular height right here. But I don't know what that is. But what I do know is I have a right triangle, and we know a lot about how to work with right triangles from our right triangle unit. If I could, right now, all I know about this right triangle is one side, but if I could figure out one angle, I could use some right triangle trig. Well, if I think about what is that angle right there? Well, this has to be a perpendicular angle, and the whole thing is 137 degrees, so that's going to leave me with 43 degrees. Not 43, 47. So that has to be 47 degrees because we took away that 90 and that's what's left, right? Now, Another way you might have thought through this is one other thing we know about parallelograms is that the consecutive angles are supplementary. So we could have thought about this same triangle, but thought about the fact that this was 43 degrees. So really, we could come up with it either way. We could either come up with the 47 degrees or the 43 degrees. Now, that means that I can find my height. It depends on which angle I use. If I use this angle, we're looking at adjacent. If I use this angle, we are looking at hypotenuse. Opposite. So it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and use sine of 43 degrees is my opposite side, which is my height, over my hypotenuse side, which is 11. And when I do that and I cross multiply, now I get this. My height is 11 times sine of 43. And I can type that into my calculator to get an approximate value. Remember, when I do this, I should make sure that I keep 3 decimal places if I'm going to do that, or I'm actually going to take this right here and I'm going to use that as my height in my calculator so that I don't have any compounded rounding troubles. And when I do that, then I can round to the nearest tenth. So when I type that into my calculator, which is buried in my bag here, making sure my mode is in degrees, 10 times 11 sine of 43, that gives me 75.019, which I can round to 75.0, and I need to make sure I have a unit, its area, so I should have centimeters squared. All right, now let's take a look at, we have 2 more examples. This one isn't drawn for us, so I'm going to go ahead and draw my parallelogram the best I can. And it says the area is 58.5, so I'm just going to write that in the center. That always helps me stay organized. We know the area of a parallelogram is base times height, so 58.5 is equal to the base, which we know is 9, times the height, which we don't know. Now we have a very straightforward equation that we can solve for height. To get that, my height has to be 6.5, and my units, this is a length, so just 6.5 centimeters. Remember, when I think about base, that's this distance, and when I think about height, that's this distance right here. All right, and then one last example on parallelograms. When I take a look at this, I'm trying to find the exact area. I'm going to start out by saying the area is going to be the base times the height. I know my base is 16. I don't know what my height is. It is not this because that is slanted. When we talk about height, we're always talking about that perpendicular height. Now, if this slant height is 14, then so, or slant length, however you want to call it, then so is this. So we know that parallelograms have congruent opposite sides. And now I do have a triangle here, and it is a 30, 60, 90 triangle, and I really want to know this height. So I'm going to go ahead and just set this up. 30, 60, 90, 1 root 3, 2. Across from 60 is my height, and across from 90 is my hypotenuse. So I get my proportion, and I'm going to cross multiply. And now I'm going to divide both sides by 2. And now I know my height is 7 root 3. Now in this problem, it also says exact, so I don't want to take this and round to a decimal. I'm just going to go ahead and multiply. What is 16 times 7? And we know that is 112. So then we keep our root 3. And we're talking about centimeters, but we're talking about area, so that's going to be centimeters squared. So when we are looking at parallelograms, we are constantly thinking about the perpendicular height. We're often going to see that right triangle work that we did in Unit 8 pop up all over the place. So make sure that if you need a refresher there, that you ask some good questions.